stop politicizing the science. Tests of scientific literacy show that the deniers are no less knowledgeable than the believers. Vaccines are probably one of the best things our species has ever done. The prospect of nuclear war would be so unthinkable, quite literally lead to the extinction of the human species. One could worry that once that taboo has been breached, once the line had been crossed, many things to fear.
He is the Harvard professor, Steven Pinker.
This lack of separation between the executive and the judiciary, so Trump being able to elect 3 officials onto the Supreme Court.
The United States already is behind the curve in terms of global progress.
The reduction in absolute poverty in the last 200 years, 95% to now something like 13.
The moral imperative is not that everyone have the same. The moral imperative is that everyone has enough.
So in another chapter of your book, Rationality, you discuss game theory. So for our listeners who might not be acquainted, basically game theory is the plotting out of what is individually rational for people in a situation where there's benefits and losses and what can be collectively rational. Now, something that occurred to me from reading that chapter was an argument for nuclear disarmament through game theory. And I just wanted to see what you thought, because growing up, I always had a severe distaste for it. I used to argue with my family about Hiroshima, for example. But in terms of nuclear armament, I think there's an argument in saying that it changes what's individually rational and what's collectively rational such that they sync up, because the threat of being nuclear bombed means that you're significantly less likely to engage in conflict because of the amount of destruction that can come about. And so it can lead to a kind of forced ceasefire. I wonder what you think of that.
Yes, there is. I in an earlier book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and again, in a subsequent book, Enlightenment Now, I discussed the theory of the nuclear peace, that the reason that we haven't had a world war since 1945 is that the world's nations have been kind of scared straight, that the prospect of nuclear war would be so unthinkable, could quite literally lead to the extinction of the human species, that it has led at least the superpowers to be skittish about challenging each other on the battlefield. And indeed, the nuclear powers have not fought a war against each other ever. I guess the last great power war, direct great power war, was the United States against China in the Korean War in 1953. At the time, China was not a nuclear power. That is an argument. There was one scholar who suggested that the nuclear bomb be given the Nobel Peace Prize. I would not nominate it, and I would not vote for it. And some problems with the nuclear peace theory, just in terms of, first of all, it's an explanation as to why there has been a decline in war. It may be that the role of nuclear weapons may be superfluous for a couple of reasons. One of them is that conventional armies are already so powerful and would be so massively destructive that no one wanted a rematch of World War II, even if nukes were kept off the table. World War II did stupendous damage, and the number of deaths in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were, a drop in the bucket compared to the 55 million or so people who died in World War II. So one of them is that there's already conventional deterrence, which may have kept the peace. Another one is that because nuclear weapons are so unthinkably destructive, there's a sense in which they are almost a bluff. And in fact, there are many cases in which wars have been fought between a non-nuclear power and a nuclear power, because the non-nuclear power knew that the nuclear power would not actually use the weapon. For one thing, they're so indiscriminately destructive that the destruction would be out of proportion to what would hope to be gained. You really want to occupy a territory that's just been nuked and it is seething with radioactivity. Clouds can blow the fallout right back on you. So a lot of reasons why a country in possession of nuclear weapons would not routinely use them. But just to give some examples, one close to home for the UK is in the early 1980s, Argentina tried to take back the Falkland Islands. Britain was a nuclear power, Argentina wasn't, because they knew that Margaret Thatcher was not going to nuke Buenos Aires, no matter what. A more recent example is that Hamas has challenged Israel, and knowing that Israel, a nuclear power, is not going to nuke Gaza. Saddam Hussein defied the United States in 2003. Anyway, plenty of examples. And the final argument against this, even though I do recognize the argument for it, is that if there is a miscalculation, a slip up, a brinksmanship, that is, given that the use of nuclear weapons could be a bluff, so far has been a bluff, could a nuclear power press its luck and assume that the other side will back down short of nuclear weapons, but be wrong? In which case, two nuclear powers could, low probability but high damage, actually engage in a nuclear war that would be just unthinkably catastrophic. So an analogy has been drawn between the teenagers' game of chicken, that this is the game in which two teenagers approach each other on a narrow highway at high speed, and the first to swerve is the chicken and loses face. And nuclear war has been nuclear confrontation has been likened to the teenagers' game of chicken, and it is a bit of a counterintuitive finding from game theory is that a strategy for winning a chicken is to sacrifice control. If you lock your steering wheel with an anti-theft device and put a brick on the accelerator and then climb into the back seat, then the other guy has no choice but to swerve. The problem being, what happens if both teenagers lock their steering wheel and put the brick on the accelerator at the same time? Then you've got catastrophe, and they both lose, much worse than the losing face. And so, given how horrendous the consequences of a mutual bluff calling could be, the world would be better off without them.
It's fascinating to me how high volatility nuclear energy in general is. You have Germany, who, for example, have been, getting rid of their nuclear power plants, whereas other people are a bit shocked because nuclear power is arguably better for the environment. There is a feeling, I think, among a lot of people that there's almost a guarantee that, we're safe from nuclear war to an extent. It almost, to some people, feels at the back of their mind like, oh, well, that's not really going to happen. But I'm curious, do you think there is that real risk that nuclear war does break out and that's the end, or do you think it's something which ultimately humans will be clever enough to stop?
Well, Vladimir Putin has recently reminded us that the nuclear option is not as taboo as we once thought, because he did spew rhetoric at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine that, as far as he's concerned, nuclear weapons were not off the table, that he might use them. Now, I think it almost certainly was a bluff, and he was referring to tactical, so-called battlefield nuclear weapons rather than strategic nuclear weapons of bombing and obliterating an entire city. But because going back to taboo, a benevolent taboo that the world has enjoyed has been the so-called nuclear taboo. Namely, it's kind of been unthinkable as a routine weapon of war, even for countries that possess it. And we might even be thankful for it. And Putin was weakening the nuclear taboo by even bringing it up as a possible option. And then one could worry that once that taboo has been breached, once the line had been crossed, well, the other guy's using nuclear weapons, so we're entitled to retaliate in kind. And even a small battlefield or so-called tactical nuclear weapon could lead to a cycle of retaliation that ended in catastrophe once the taboo had been breached. But anyway, whatever complacency the world might have had, well, certainly the world was by no means complacent in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. There were massive ban the bomb demonstrations in Britain in the 60s. In the 80s, when Ronald Reagan wanted to introduce medium-range nuclear forces into Europe, there were massive European protests. There was were television docudramas that tried to illustrate the horror of nuclear war that got a lot of attention. You're right that had faded with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. But it was put back on the table by Putin's breaching of the nuclear taboo. And whether it would be a good thing for people to be reminded of this sword of Damocles and perhaps renew the push to abolish nuclear weapons, that may not be such a terrible thing to renew that horror and put it to use. Now, what would not be good is if that bled over into nuclear power, which is really it's a different technology. Nuclear power plants, even if one were to melt down, cannot explode like a nuclear weapon. And there's no easy pathway from nuclear energy to nuclear weapons. There are dozens of countries that have nuclear power, but only 9 that have nuclear weapons. And there's at least one country that has nuclear weapons but no nuclear power, namely Israel. So they're not the same thing. And indeed, if the taboo against nuclear weapons bleeds over into a distrust of nuclear power, that would be extremely unfortunate, as Germany has shown by, I think, prematurely and immaturely closing its nuclear power plants after the Fukushima disaster, and therefore being more vulnerable to cut off of gas from Russia, of carbon emissions that have not declined, because if you don't have nuclear power, then you're going to burn fossil fuels. The world needs energy, loves energy, is going to want more and more and more energy as poorer parts of the world deservedly try to catch up with the developed West. Energy is good, and the only truly scalable carbon-free source of energy is nuclear power. It would be foolish to shut down the plants that we have, or to not develop new ones out of fear of nuclear weapons, which are just a different animal.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. I just wanted to drop you in a word from our sponsor Manscaped. You can use the discount code LOAF to get your discount, because even a lion needs to tame its mane.
Get the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra from Manscaped now. Stay fresh with no cuts, so that your baguette leaves no crumbs.